Hey everyone, let's dive right into this explainer. If you've ever worked in a complex, fast-paced environment, chances are you've bumped into Scrum. But here's the thing, so many teams out there treat Scrum like it's just a tedious list of meetings to attend or just some way to manage a backlog. Today, we're going to explore why Scrum's rules really aren't just bureaucratic red tape. Instead, they form a tightly engineered architectural framework that is entirely dependent on three critical pillars. And trust me, if you knock even one of these pillars away, the whole structure collapses. So let's break down exactly why Scrum absolutely requires these three pillars to actually work.
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the bedrock of empiricism. Then, we'll build our three pillars: transparency, inspection, and adaptation. After that, we'll check out the artifacts and events, and finally, wrap up with the values that bring the whole thing to life.
All right, Section 1, the bedrock of empiricism, which is the absolute foundation of Scrum. Before we can even think about building our columns, we really have to understand the ground we're building on, right? Scrum is completely founded on lean thinking, which is all about cutting out the fluff and focusing on the essentials, and empiricism. Now, empiricism asserts that true knowledge comes from actual experience and making your decisions based on what you can actually observe. In complex environments, where the future is basically a giant question mark, you just can't rely on rigid predictive plans. We can only control our risk by observing what has already happened, experiencing it firsthand, and then deciding what to do next based on reality.
Moving on to Section 2, Pillar 1, Transparency, illuminating the work.
Transparency means the emergent process and the work itself has to be completely visible to everybody, both the people doing the work and the people receiving it. Low transparency? Well, that leads to decisions that absolutely diminish your value and heavily escalate your risk. I mean, think about it. If the work isn't fully visible, you are quite literally making decisions in the dark. It covers up the real problems. It leads to what we often call watermelon projects, where everything looks green and perfectly healthy on the outside, but you cut into it and it's completely red and failing on the inside. When your big decisions are based on hidden or distorted info, you're destroying the product's value. Everyone has to be looking at the exact same reality.
Next up, Section 3, Pillar 2, Inspection, which is all about detecting variances. So once our work is actually visible, we can enact our next pillar. The Scrum Guide has this fantastic line that brilliantly illustrates the unbreakable domino effect here. It says, "Inspection without transparency is misleading and wasteful." To optimize predictability, we have to frequently and diligently inspect our progress toward our goals, right? We're on the hunt for any undesirable variances or hiccups. But here is the catch. You simply cannot inspect what you cannot see. If transparency is low, any attempt to inspect the work is a total waste of time because you're basically looking at a funhouse mirror.
That brings us to Section 4, Pillar 3, Adaptation, or making the adjustment. This whole chain reaction concludes with a pretty powerful and strict rule. Inspection without adaptation is considered pointless. What happens if your diligent inspection reveals that a process is going off the rails or that the product is just unacceptable? You have to adapt immediately. The process or the materials must be adjusted right then and there to stop things from getting worse. Identifying a problem is entirely pointless if you're not going to actually do something about it. And honestly, adaptation is incredibly difficult if the people doing the work aren't empowered. This is exactly why Scrum mandates a self-managing team. You need a team that can pivot the exact second they learn something new. Okay, Section 5, Artifacts and Events. This is the roof and the rooms of our structure. Now that our three columns are standing tall, let's look at the structure they actually support. Think of the three Scrum artifacts as the physical materials that give us that transparency we talked about earlier. But they aren't just loose, random lists. They are strictly bound by very specific commitments. The product backlog is bound by the product goal, your big, long-term objective. The sprint backlog is bound by the sprint goal, your single focus for the current sprint. And finally, the increment is strictly bound by the definition of done. The literal moment a backlog item meets this definition, boom, an increment is born. These commitments exist for one massive reason. They guarantee that everyone inspecting the artifacts has the exact same baseline to adapt from. It completely reinforces our empiricism. Meanwhile, the 5 Scrum events are basically your deliberate, scheduled cadence mechanisms. They ensure our final two pillars, inspection and adaptation, actually happen on a regular basis.
The sprint itself is the container for the whole shebang. Inside it, you've got sprint planning to initiate the work, the daily scrum for the developers to inspect and adapt every single day, the sprint review to inspect the outcome with your stakeholders, and the sprint retrospective to look in the mirror at the team's internal processes. These events create a totally predictable rhythm, and if you hold them at the same time and place, they optimally eliminate the need for outside meetings. That is a huge benefit. But if you skip or alter these events, you lose a critical opportunity to inspect and adapt.
Finally, Section 6, Values Bring Pillars Alive, which is all about building trust.
Look, a brilliantly architected framework with solid pillars, artifacts, and events, it's still just an empty shell until real human beings step inside. And this is exactly why the Scrum Guide highlights 5 distinct values: commitment to achieving goals and having each other's backs, focus on the actual work of the sprint, openness about the work and the roadblocks you're facing, respect for each other as capable, independent professionals, and the courage to do the right thing, even when the problem is incredibly tough. Why do these matter so much? Because when a team genuinely embodies these 5 values, they build trust. And trust is the magic ingredient that truly brings those empirical pillars of transparency, inspection, and adaptation to life. Without trust, people hide the truth. That kills transparency, which breaks inspection, which makes adaptation literally impossible.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want you to take a hard look at your own Scrum practices. Are you just blindly following rules, or are your pillars genuinely supporting your work? Are you merely going through the motions, showing up to meetings, checking off backlog items like chores? Or are these 3 foundational pillars, transparency, inspection, and adaptation, actually bearing the heavy load of your complex work? Remember, changing the core design of Scrum or leaving pieces out usually just covers up deeper problems and limits your success. It all comes back to empiricism. See reality for what it is, inspect it honestly, and have the courage to adapt. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive, and I will catch you in the next explainer.